Hey guys, Morgan from Rebellious Reels. We talk about all things movies and TV. And today we're going to be covering one of the most controversial movies in history. That's right, it's time to talk about The Birth of a Nation. So, the reason I sat through this overly long behemoth of a silent film is because I'm currently going through 1001 movies you have to see before you die, and I've decided I'm doing the 2022 version of it. I was originally going to make a video covering this alongside the other 3 movies from the 1910s on that list, but then I thought, nah, this warrants its own video. So, The Birth of a Nation. Why is it so controversial? Well, in short, this is a Ku Klux Klan propaganda film. And for those of you who live outside the United States and might not know who the Ku Klux Klan are, they are a white supremacist hate group. And they started shortly after the Civil War, when the South lost, obviously. And then they had a bit of a resurgence in 1915 after dying down for a while. In part because of this film. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Why is a propaganda film for a hate group on the top 1001 movies you have to see before you die? Well, in short, it's because this film revolutionized the film industry. It was the first very long film that wasn't a serial, for one thing. It's 3 hours and 15 minutes long. And it also pioneered some film techniques that are still used today, including close-ups, fade-outs, and using an orchestra for the film score. It's pretty cheap looking by today's standards, but for its time, it was a technical masterpiece. And it was also the first film shown in the White House, and it's been preserved by the Library of Congress. So yes, there actually is logic to this, believe it or not. Now that I've got those historical facts out of the way, let's talk about this movie proper. Is it any good? Well, the first half is harmless enough. Just a pretty typical Civil War movie that just happens to be told from the perspective of the South. We follow a northern family and a southern family who are sort of friends, I guess, who end up sending their kids off to war. And I must say, this movie actually does a halfway decent job painting a picture of the horrors of war. I especially love this one scene where a member of one of the families has to watch a member of the other family die right in front of him. It's actually pretty heartbreaking. While we're on the topic of positive things to say about this movie, can I just say that the professional critics are 100% right? This is a technical masterpiece for its time, and the acting is good, the shots all look good, and the people who created this film score deserve all the credit in the world for it. It sounds great, and the music usually fits the scenes pretty well. And that's where the positive things I have to say about this movie end. The first half of it is tolerable, but even it drags on way too long. Especially that battle scene at the end of it, where some of that could have easily been cut. And I could also do without the whole blackface thing. But even then, I guess it was the 1910s, So I kind of had to expect that, but still. Now is a good time to mention that this movie is divided into two distinct parts. The first half deals with the Civil War, and the second half deals with Reconstruction. For those of you who don't know, Reconstruction is the United States' attempt to rebuild the South after the Civil War. So, that is the part where this movie goes completely off the rails. Normally I would give a spoiler warning for this part, but since I don't want any of you watching this movie anyways, I'll just go ahead and keep talking and you can keep watching. So, after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, which is where the first part of this movie left off, the new administration becomes increasingly hard on white Southerners. Northern soldiers are rude to them, blacks are running wild, everything is a mess. Things get worse and worse, and as time goes on, our main character, seeing how horrible things have gotten, decides to do something. Here's a good time to point out how historically inaccurate the second half of this movie is. Basically, there's this part where interracial marriage is legalized, which is obviously inaccurate, because interracial marriage wasn't even legal when my grandma was born in 1933, let alone right after the Civil War. And that's not the only historical inaccuracy here. There's all sorts of little details like that are just not accurate. Like, one of the most notable ones, I'd say, is when the black people are allowed to vote and the white people aren't? What drugs are these people on? The moment where the film really goes off the rails, however, is when our protagonist, one of the Southern boys from before, sees a group of children playing with a white cloth, and he decides to use that as a Ku Klux Klan uniform. Now, I could laugh at the ridiculousness of the Ku Klux Klan using a literal children's game as inspiration for their uniforms, but instead I'll move on to the next part, where our main character's sister, I should say, goes down to the springs and encounters a black man who tries to force her into marriage. And she ends up jumping off a cliff to escape him. Yup, you heard that right. And to make matters worse, our main character proceeds to get the KKK together to do some vigilante justice against this guy. And of course, the evil black people are hiding him because he's one of their own, I guess. They find the evil black guy and then proceed to lynch him. And yes, this is portrayed as justified. After this happens, the government cracks down on the KKK. Gee, I wonder why. Then the evil mixed race guy, who is lieutenant governor, there we go again with the historical inaccuracies, proceeds to try to forcibly take the governor's daughter as his wife. And the KKK have to come and save her. That is the stupidest sentence I have ever said in my life. Anyway, the movie ends happily, quote unquote, with elections being fair and a bunch of Klansmen heroically protecting the black people against voting. Because black people are evil, right? Wrong. The second half of this movie was pure torture to get through. Not only was it overly long and drawn out, but the historical inaccuracies and the sheer propaganda of it just hurt to watch. What's odd, though, is that I did some quick research on the guy who directed this, D.W. Griffith, and he doesn't seem like a Klansman, oddly enough. I say this because after this movie came out, he made a movie called Intolerance about the horrors of intolerance. And he also said that the people who were calling him racist were actually the intolerant ones. So, what was this guy's motivation? Well, if I had to guess, and I am just guessing here, I can't read minds, I think that D.W. Griffith saw either the novel or the play that this movie is based on, The Klansman by Thomas Dixon Jr., and he decided to make it into a movie, and just for the sake of being edgy and promoting free speech. In fact, he even said after the movie came out that it was an exercise in free expression. From everything I've read about him, I think D.W. Griffith was most likely an ignorant white boy who didn't realize the consequences of his actions. And this tells me that he was likely the 1910s equivalent of one of those people who write stories that are just intended to be edgy for edgy's sake, and then they call anyone who dares to call them out for it social justice warriors. I don't think he was hateful, at least not by the standards of his time. I think he was ignorant and too stubborn to realize his mistakes. That's just my interpretation, though. Anyway, it really doesn't matter what his motivation was, because the end result was the same. This movie led to a resurgence in the KKK and a rise in anti-black violence. I only bring it up because I think it's important to point out that the "it's just fiction" or "I'm just exercising my right to free speech" justifications are not always valid excuses. Especially if you're punching down or making fun of someone who the general public doesn't really understand. And this movie does both. The sad thing is, even I'm guilty of this. When I was younger, I wrote a bunch of stories with racist and homophobic language just for the sake of being shocking. And when people called me out on it, I did tell them they were being too sensitive. I defended myself by saying it was realistic. And I was basically one of those edgelords I just mentioned. So, in that sense, am I really any better than D.W. Griffith? The answer is yes, because I actually grew and learned from my mistakes. He never did. So I guess my final message with this review is that if you're going to write anything, whether it be a movie, a TV show, a book, or whatever, that features people of another race or culture than you, get a sensitivity reader. Talk to people outside your own tribe, and don't be like D.W. Griffith, who called the people who were calling out his ignorance intolerant. Oh, and I give this movie a 4 out of 10. It's well made for a silent film, and the first half is at least tolerable, if a little boring. But man, that second half just drags the whole thing down. with how racist, not to mention melodramatic it is. Well, that got heavy there at the end, but this movie warranted it. In my next video, I'll be reviewing some more stuff from the 1910s, including a serial titled Les Vampires and 2 more D.W. Griffith films, including the aforementioned one about intolerance. Once that's over, I can finally move on to the 1920s, which, from what my dad tells me, is when the best silent films were made. So, if you want to see that, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Check out my music and book channels in the description below. I'm Morgan from Rebellious Reels, and I'm out.